Good morning all, and welcome back to what is effectively a re-recording of our webinar from last Thursday. And for those that joined us last Thursday, it was all about Green Homes Grant and the effects of shallow refit. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson, and I'm welcoming back to the stage Steve Hodgson. Morning, Steve.
Morning, Andy. You all right?
Not bad. Now, folks, because this is a re-recording, we don't nearly need to go through all the general kind of rigmarole that I normally tell you about how you can engage with us. So without further ado, I am going to welcome to the stage Steve Hodgson and his presentation all about Green Homes Grant and the effects of shallow refit. Over to yourself, Steve.
It's retrofit, Andy.
My apologies, guys.
The presentation today, what's in a title? It's yes, it is about retrofit, and the term shallow retrofit is not necessarily a term that you'll hear anywhere else. It's something that I've coined really to try and deal with something other than deep retrofit. But we're mainly going to be looking at external wall insulation. This morning, we're not going to be looking at all forms of retrofit insulation, mostly on EWI. So you know who I am, most of you, Steve Hodgson, CEO of PCA, and we've been spending quite a lot of time on thinking about the effects of retrofit on properties, and this is just one of a number of lines of thought that we're having, and things that we're just an indication of the sorts of things that we're learning and trying to share with the world on what we see as being some of the things that surveyors and building professionals need to be aware of when they're looking at houses and properties that have been subject to retrospective insulation retrofit. So today we're going to consider how surveyors deal with buildings that are changed by external wall insulation particularly. So we're going to be looking at very, very quickly in some of the cases at the beginning of the presentation, what is retrofit? We're also going to think about why it's really important that retrofit as a concept and the delivery of energy saving measures works. We have some quite demanding obligations under international deals to reduce quite significantly the amount of energy we use in our homes, and retrofit will play an enormous part in that, and therefore we must do what we can to ensure that retrofit is properly adopted and taken forward. We'll touch on that a little bit all the way through the program. We'll look at what is deep retrofit, and then we'll kind of look at what other forms of retrofit, if you like, there are. We'll look at things like the inspection and the diagnostic challenge that buildings that have been covered with insulation or filled with insulation pose to the surveyor and the moisture diagnostic process. We'll also think very quickly about remediation strategies. So all buildings get damp, or if all buildings can get damp. And so does retrofit and does the presence of insulation on or within the building create any additional challenges when we're trying to fix that dampness? We'll have a couple of case studies towards the end, and then we'll have a couple of thoughts and a round-off right at the very conclusion with some questions. And I know this is a re-record, so not to pretend it's live, but we have managed to retain some of the questions that were asked at the end of the presentation or through the presentation last time. So we'll kind of have Andy pitch some of those questions to me. So, basic principles of retrofit. There are only really two, well, really one, and that's to control energy loss. And that's to reduce energy loss, keep more of what we burn inside the building so we don't have to burn so much to keep the building warm. And retrofit helps the property do that in two ways. It reduces dramatically the amount of uncontrolled air exchange around gaps and cracks in the building. So you put cavity wall insulation in the building, and it kind of not only helps keep the planes of the masonry warmer, but it also fills the gaps around things like window reveals and floor joists and this sort of stuff. So retrofit, whether it's internal, external, or in the cavity, reduces the amount of uncontrolled infiltration. The other thing it does, as I just alluded to, is it makes the planes, the panels, the ability for those walls, floors, ceilings to retain heat more effectively. So it improves their thermal performance, their capacity to allow heat to transfer from the inside environment to the outside. And so those two things are sort of very obvious, but they're worth mentioning at this point because it's kind of, when we start talking about other things, it's important to know and have established that. So, wall insulation. How do we insulate walls? There's three main ways to insulate walls. There's external wall insulation, which is what we're going to be looking at mostly this morning, which is the application or the installation of insulative materials, usually foams of one description or another, to the outside of the building, usually mechanically fixed, and they're then protected by paints or renders to help to keep them weathertight. And that allows the whole of the fabric, the whole of the thickness of the masonry structure to be warmer. And yeah, the new external layers form the weatherproofing barriers. Now, I just thought I'd kind of, anybody who's watched any of my presentations in the past will know that I put some kind of odd photographs in, some things that are kind of sometimes a bit ironic. Most people miss it, so do I sometimes. But this is a drawing of a good detail of external wall insulation. It shows the insulation. It shows the ventilation to the subfloor area or to a vented area below our floor. But what it also shows is the fact that the drawing details that the insulation goes straight down below ground level and is buried into the floor to give continuity. This is how you're supposed to do it. Cavity wall insulation, obviously we know what that is. It goes in the cavity in standard cavity constructed buildings. There are some considerations with that. It's not for today's presentation. And then internal wall insulation too, which is, again, materials with high insulative values, qualities that are put onto the inside surface of the walls. And that basically allows the rest of the structure to remain pretty cold, but builds the insulation into the top layer, if you like, from the inside. So a slightly different way of approach, but can be very, very effective at improving the thermal performance of the house. So in roofs, it's pretty simple, really. You can either insulate against the roof, against the ceiling, or apply a combination of the two. And there are all sorts of details. This little drawing has been pinched from the emerging British Standard 5250. Probably get in trouble for producing it, but it's not pretty straightforward. It just shows the details that can be adopted for roof insulation. There's lots of debate at the moment about ventilation in roof spaces, but that's perhaps for another day. When you look at floors are not great at insulating unless they've been specifically designed with insulation in mind. So modern solid floors are pretty good. But one of the areas that there have been lots of kind of considerations, thoughts, and head scratching about is how we insulate existing suspended timber floors. And generally, again, there's 2 or 3 different ways. You either insulate by putting something on top of the floor, or you put something underneath the floor. And with solid floors, the only way to retrofit an existing solid floor is to put something on top of the slab. But again, very difficult with the thicknesses. Now, I have been a bit cheeky again and put a photograph that I pinched from the internet of the foam spraying machine that trundles around under the floor, squirting foam onto the underside of timber joists. Not something that's there because we condone it or we think it's a great idea. In fact, we're very skeptical of it and very worried about it, and how it works and what it does to potentially to the vapor content of timbers and all of that, the moisture content of timbers and all of that. But anyway, there are ways to do it. But again, worth looking at these things, but not necessarily dwelling too long on them. So one of the reasons I showed you the foam spraying machine was because that starts already, generally, people start thinking, well, what are the implications of that? Well, that's a good thought to have, because when we change the thermal performance of the building, when we start bolting on insulation to the inside, the outside, or within a structure, it alters it. It alters it, and it alters it kind of pretty much permanently. So we should be thinking about the implications of what we do when we insulate. What knock-ons are there going to be? What knock-ons are they going to be in regard to occupation, fabric, construction, and all of that kind of stuff? Can we get continuity? And in order to affect a deep retrofit solution, which is where you think about absolutely everything and you put the building, make sure the building remains in balance to get the most effective and the best returns on your with regards to energy efficiency, is you have to think about the building as a whole. And a really fantastic little tool that the Retrofit Society for STBA, Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, have made available is this wheel. And essentially what you do is you click on one of the blocks on the outside to suggest that you're going to think about using one particular form of insulation. And what that then does is point you to all the areas that could be affected and how severely those areas can be affected by your intended works. And it's a really, really clever way of sort of illustrating that small changes in one place can have an effect that you perhaps didn't consider in another, and it makes sure you kind of balance your intended retrofit solutions correctly. Very good, and a real illustration of the need to sort of think of the building as a whole when you think about improving energy performance. So there's a few little mantras that I've picked up. None of them are mine, I'm afraid. They're things that you've all heard before, but it's worth making just a note of what they are and what they affect. So that whole idea of fabric first. Now, I thought fabric first only had one real definitional meaning, and that was around ensuring that the fabric, the walls, the floors, the ceilings, the underlying structure was in good shape before you even began to think about how you insulate it and how you improve its thermal performance. Now, to me, it still means that, but I have found out that fabric first also means that actually, to some of the insulation world, that actually you think about insulating the fabric before you do other interventions. But I think commonly a lot of people like me think that consider that the fabric first element is always think about how the building is shedding water, how it's performing as a unit, and how effective all of those rainwater management systems are before you start to think about insulation. The other thing, of course, is because insulation generally reduces that uncontrolled infiltration of air, then air exchange will be reduced, and therefore you need to think about indoor air quality. So think about ventilation right at the beginning. We'll come on to that again in a moment. So fabric first, make sure the building is in good shape before you do anything else. Picture of a wall tie in the background. It's much better to find out whether the cavity wall ties are corroded or damaged before you start to install insulation, because the cost of remediation and repair afterwards is going to be colossal. The other thing, of course, is the telltale sign of cavity wall tie corrosion is cracking. And if you've insulated the outside with a material that has some dynamism, then perhaps that early warning sign is missed, and the implications of that are that the building fails completely or spectacularly before you get any indication that there is a defect. Continuity is really important too. The idea of insulation is that you are uniform across the piece. So you want to improve the whole of the thermal performance of the building, because leaving gaps in it creates cold bridges or areas where you'll have differential internal surface temperatures. And if that happens, then they become susceptible to localized condensation or atmospheric moisture problems. The temperature value, the temperatures in localized areas, particularly in corners and things like that, can be really susceptible to condensation. And that's a really undesirable outcome of incomplete or or insulation materials or insulation projects where you don't have good continuity in the system. So continuity, really important. The other thing, again, we keep mentioning it, I keep mentioning it, is the insulation element. So there's two phrases, isn't there? There's no insulation without ventilation, which is kind of a thing stolen from a guy called Peter Rickaby and the work that was done on PAS 2035. The PAS is the PAS 2030, 35s are the publicly available standards that sort of guide insulation companies towards good process and good delivery of insulation. So these principles, the things that I'm just describing now, are embedded in those standards, and they really are the Bibles for the insulation industry. So no insulation without ventilation, and insulate tight, ventilate right, which is an adage that we all kind of have grown up with. I think it's something and a term that's been around for years, but never truer with retrofit. Retrofit will have a massive effect on indoor air quality if we don't do anything to draw air back in to a building that otherwise has no mechanical systems to keep that air balance right. And I have to say that, you know, there has never been a more important time to consider indoor air quality. You know, we are on the verge of another lockdown, a national lockdown. We're going into the winter. Think therefore about not just the kind of the issues around viral control, but actually, you know, all we need is a cold snap. We've probably got the worst. We're probably entering the worst condensation and mold year possibly on record. It will only be the weather that dictates anything other than a bad condensation season. So deep retrofit. Is deep retrofit possible? Absolutely it is. But deep retrofit requires that whole kind of joined up sets of thoughts that mean that every element and every part of the building has been considered. So roofs and floors and walls and everything else have all been integrated together. There's thoughts about the glazing, the air exchange, everything has been considered. And the mechanical and the engineering solutions on the outside have also been considered. So how are you getting rid of the rainwater goods, drainage, all of that stuff comes into it. And it's possible and it can work incredibly effectively. But the one thing to remember with deep retrofit and the delivery of successful deep retrofit is it ain't cheap. I have to say I've spotted this article, Passive House Magazine upgrade in Northern Ireland thing. It's very worth a look if you're interested in how deep retrofit can be delivered. It's a nice little article. It's quite concise. There's quite a lot in there about it. This photograph isn't of that project. And when I first put it up, I thought, well, that's a photograph of a property from a site that's claiming that this property was deep retrofitted. Somebody can email me if they can spot on this photograph why I don't think that this property is actually that good. I didn't spot it at first, but actually it turns out there are a couple of major inconsistencies on this property that would give me cause to question my own initial thought that this was an all right sample of a deep retrofit job. But deep retrofit can work and does work and should be what we adopt. So now we come on to what is not deep retrofit. If deep retrofit is a consideration of the whole structure and a thought about everything and how it all fits together, what's the opposite of deep? I kind of guess it's shallow. And why do we do shallow retrofit? Probably mostly because it's cheaper. There isn't sufficient money in the contract to allow us to do the things that we want to do. Now, what I will also introduce at this stage is that I was very lucky to be asked to go and have, I say lucky, I was asked to go and have a look at a couple of properties in South Wales only a few weeks ago. All of these properties have had insulation projects. It's all external wall insulation jobs. There's only 4 of them, and the vast majority of the photographs, if not all the photographs from here on in and all the bits of information, are all relevant and all relate to these 4 properties. Now, the one that you see in the bottom left-hand corner is also featured in the backwashed image. is a property where there's a delightful old lady. House is absolutely spotless. She lives on her own. The property is quite an interesting place. It's very much a traditional stone built or stone frontaged house in the Welsh valleys, but it's got a few things that we'll look at as we go around. Not least, perhaps you're already spotting things in the images shown. But there's the front of it, and when we start having a look at it, I'm looking when I first pull out of the outside of the building. I'm looking for those elements on ventilation, continuity. I'm looking for areas where potentially there could be problems with detailing or water ingress. And you look at this property, and yes, it's had insulation. It's had 4 inches of insulation. It's 100 millimeters of insulation all the way around, and it's been finished with a dashed coating. But these are the sorts of things before you even go near the property, before you really got out of the car, that you start to spot. So it's got quite an interesting. The building, you might be able to see just from the top right-hand image. There's the divider from the backwashed image. It's a stone property, nicely sort of featured stone, but the insulation is finished right down the middle. They've stopped it between the two properties. Top right-hand corner, you can start to see issues where they've worked around the electrical features, but then all along the front of the house, where you've got that interesting verge detail, they've just worked up to it. And there is some evidence, if you look hard, that the soffit and the verge are probably a bit rotten as well. There's some decay in that already. So this is before we've only got even close. You also see there's been some mechanical damage to the bottom left at the front of the house as well, where somebody's backed a car into it. But that also shows that the insulation has been finished well short of the floor. So these are sort of some ideas of should we call it suboptimal retrofit, shallow retrofit, whatever you want to call it. These are the things that I think that not only we as the PCA as dampness experts start to worry about when we see, but I do know that the legislators and the standards holders, people like SWIGA and those sorts of organisations, also cringe at it. These are not things that they want to see, but having a detail like the one in that washout at the back or the image at the back of the larger image has to give us concern. Looking at why this happens, well, it's not cheap to do deep retrofit. So if there's not sufficient cost to do the detailing, not sufficient funds to do the detailing, we have problems. The other issue, of course, is speed. So to actually change the roof and change the gutters and change all these other things, it takes time and it's difficult. So where you have people that don't have the skills or the knowledge or the time or the money, then these corners kind of get cut. Now that's made worse in many respects because the client doesn't know what good looks like. How many of us have had experience with external wall insulation as building professionals? Well, a growing number, of course, and we are seeing problems and we've been asked to look at them, and we are seeing them as just a matter of causing banal defects. So we're becoming more familiar with them. But the average homeowner will never have bought a house or will never have procured external wall insulation or any other form of retrofit more than once, probably. There will be some, but probably this is the first time we're buying this stuff. So we don't know what good looks like. And the other issue is that, of course, the contractors, in some regard, can kind of get away with it, mostly because of the stuff you've seen at the beginning, because they don't know what they're looking at. The contractors can get away with it. The next phrase is everyone seems to think it's okay. That's not true. I don't think, actually, there's lots of professionals that don't think it's okay. But there are some professionals that kind of don't know the difference between good and bad. And that's a real worry. That's kind of partly why we're doing what we're doing and shining a spotlight on some of these issues. So, what are the effects of this suboptimal or shallower retrofit. I've got some bullets down here. So these are the slightly more, should we say, benign effects. So sometimes there are no adverse consequences, no obvious adverse consequences. The fact is that the building might not be quite as energy efficient as it could. The wheel might not be going around quite so quickly on the meter. But actually, who knows, or who kind of cares too, as long as there aren't any major issues. The energy performance of the building will have been massively improved, but you know, there's still some room for improvement, but it's not causing a problem, so on. There is a sort of a thought and a consideration that with the advent of the insulation, some future repairs may be more expensive, it may be more complicated, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail soon. But again, that's something that can be pushed off a little bit. And then there's the indoor air quality thing. Indoor air quality, unless there's been measures taken to retain the balance, will probably be reduced. And in some cases, it might only be a little bit. And for example, the building that we're looking at the photographs on at the moment, one person in the occupation. It's a 3-bedroom house. It's reasonably spacious. There are no elements in there that cause high levels of production. So a little bit of reduced ventilation, air exchange will not result in a massive problem in this particular case. So no one gets ill, everyone's happy. However, if we look at some of the less benign effects, coal bridges. The fact is, with the photographs and the images that we're looking in the background, there will be coal bridges. Now, if the building has high levels of occupation and lots of moisture production, the heating inside the building is still dodgy. It's not as good as it could be. These coal bridges become highly significant, or can become highly significant. And as a result, we can get localized mold growth and we can get problems with indoor air quality. Mold and condensation, these are all coming in together. The detailing, as you've seen in lots of these photographs that are coming up and more that will follow, there are huge potentials for water ingress. And there is water ingress. And what happens when you get water ingress? Then you have some means of either a mechanism then for the deterioration of the underlying structures, timbers that may come in contact, all that kind of stuff. But you've also got plaster falling off the wall that needs to be fixed. And we'll think about that later. We've also got, I've said, it sounds like the previous one, significantly increased repair costs. Now, we'll think about the roof and the roof that intersects it. The roof may fail before the insulation fails. If you have to then start stripping stuff out, then it starts to get highly, significantly more expensive. So you have to think about that too. So I'm going to show you, we'll look at some coal bridges and some stuff. So I'm going to try and make sure, see if this video works. But we'll look at this property later in a bit more detail. But I thought this was kind of quite a neat thing to show you. This is an example of a coal bridge. I'm going to come to the left-hand edge of the building. I'm going to come around the corner. We're going to see the fence post, the gate post is embedded into the wall, and we've got that full finishing, some cracking. There's also some discoloration, and some unevenness in the render finish, and some moisture damage left in the final. So we'll have a look at that fence post here. Look, so that fence post is worked up to. This is a peculiar property. I'll tell you a little bit more about it when we look at it in more detail in a moment. It's a great exemplar of kind of not knowing quite what's going on, or not being able to derive a full picture. But look at this detail. The original brickwork is been covered with 2 inches of insulation in this particular instance, about 2 inches, about 50 mil. But that fence post sits on the concrete floor. It's wet. It's already showing some evidence of deterioration at the base. But you can stick your finger up the back of it. So the fence post doesn't actually finish hard against the brickwork. So there's a gap. And that gap goes right up behind that fence post. Now, the issues are, for me, as much as anything else, that there is a potential for a localized cold patch inside that building. But also the fact is that at some point that fence post is going to have to come out, and that fence post comes out and leaves a great big gap. How do you fix it? How do you fix it? Now, I have to say, since the live version of this video, I have had some contacts to say that some organizations, including Swigo, are starting to deliver specifications and working best practice on how you do this stuff. So it's good to know that people are thinking logically about how we repair these sorts of defects. I'm going to show you a picture of a property. This is a different building, but again, same trip down to South Wales. This is a building in a terrace, and this is my kind of absolute. I've grown to really fear this detail, but you'll see that the property, the subject property, is the one with the satellite dish on it. The house next door has also got insulation, but it's not as thick on the walls. And it's not great, but you can see how there's a step between the two properties. You can see how there's an intersecting pitched roof that runs into the back of the property. There's another one at the other side, which you'll see in a moment. But you can also see the folly of this detail. So here we go. So they have the hanging gardens sort of starting to grow out of the interface. Well, that tells us something. You go down to the base of the wall, and again, the insulation stops short of the floor. It isn't made up. That is slightly above ground level too. And then on the other side, you've got the other intersecting roof and the gutter that's made into the wall. You can also see there's a cover strip that goes across. The roof hasn't been extended, so the if you like, the insulation is kind of, the gutters sit behind the insulation. The gutter joints sit behind the insulation. Now, you may well think that this is just a one-off or bad or whatever. Unfortunately, this feature with the guttering that disappears off into a hole in the insulation is all too common. And when I was looking for some information to show me what the manufacturer's details should be around intersecting ground floor pitched and flat roofs, and here's one for a canopy and a porch, I found very, very, very little. The one thing that I was sort of put onto, and thanks to Adam Clutterbuck for sending me the link to this particular installation detail, is that actually it appears that there is some design going and thought going into actually creating this feature of embedded gutters. Now, if you've got a stop end that's inside essentially the gutter, and yes, all right, this shows with a powder coated aluminium flashing on the inside. These two, the buildings that I looked at as well in Wales had a metal or a galvanized boot on the end of the thing. It leaked. It didn't fit properly. It was only on two sides and not on four. They were all in a terrible state, and I would suspect that, you know, how often does a plastic stop end fail? Regularly enough to know that doing this is not going to be a great idea, and that in time you are highly likely to get a problem where you've got a gutter inside the wall. Now, to me, the only real way of combating this detail is to strip the roof back, to strip the intersecting roof back and bring the insulation down below the roof, and then remake the roof and the flashings up to the insulation. But so far, with all the buildings I've looked at, I haven't seen that done once. We're back to that first building, the first building that I looked at of the four. And we're now thinking about ventilation and insulation. Ventilation. I could not find a single point of air entry into this building other than the windows that were open. The building isn't installed with trickle vents in the windows, as far as I can see. I didn't look at all of them because I wasn't allowed to go upstairs in this property. The lady wouldn't let me plonk about upstairs in in our house, but I didn't see any in the downstairs rooms. You see the flue that's poking out of the extension. That doesn't belong to this property. That serves the neighbouring extension. So I see no ventilation whatsoever in this property. And again, with one person rattling around it, it may well work okay. But the truth is, you stick half a dozen occupants in there potentially, and the house is big enough to accommodate that. You would have a totally different moisture loading, and it would be I reckon an absolute doozy for quite severe condensation problems, particularly with the way that some of the detailing has been done around it. So we're going to move on to that kind of whole inspection challenge. Now, the insulation covers stuff up. It's bound to. It conceals whatever was underneath it, in the same way as a render coat does or a paint coat does. The degree of concealment changes with the material, granted, but we're talking now about a building with 4 inches of insulation on the back. Now, these 4 images across the bottom were all taken at the same property. So we're talking about the back of a terrace with an offshoot kitchen, a small yard, and another extension. You can just see the roof in the second image from the left of the neighbouring extension roof as well. It's very, very exposed at the back. You look out the backyard and it goes straight onto the fell, onto the Welsh Hills. So it gets a lot of prevailing wind and a lot of weather exposure. Now, this property is only damp in 2 places, 3 places really. The window reveals at the back, the back window at ground floor level, and also periodically on the bit of wall that's kind of the end of the if you like, the dividing wall between the new and the old part of the offshoot and the original part of the house, or the major part of the house. So you can see it on the 3rd image. So that's the beginning of the kitchen, living room at the back, or dining room at the back, and that wall gets wet when it rains hard. Now, you can see from the images of the outside, the 2 photographs of the outside, that you have that embedded stop end feature again, and you also have the fact that the roof hasn't been extended at high level. But actually, trying to find the point of ingress with this property, trying to find where the water's coming in and explain why it's appeared in those 2 reveals and not higher up, not on the planes of the wall, but just in the reveals, not across the window head, not upstairs, not on anywhere else apart from just those few areas. It's quite challenging because you can't see where the water's tracking. So I have to say that my own impression of doing some of these inspections, it's a lot more like looking at a basement waterproofing failure than it is about a normal damp ingress issue, because the water can be tracking around behind the insulation or inside the voids quite large distances by the look of it before it shows itself. You can't see the wet patches on the outside so clearly either, and certainly on this property the owner has worked very hard to try and eliminate the problems himself. So he's filled in all the cracks, he's painted the property very well, he's gone mad with a silicone gun to try and close up anything that appears. And yet when it rains, and it rains hard, the water still appears on the reveals and on that peculiar section of wall that seems slightly detached from the rest of the building. There's no continuity with the wet patches. So I'm struggling to know whether the water's getting in at high level, whether it's getting in at the stop end, and if it is getting at the stop end, it certainly doesn't explain why the far side of the windows are wet. You'd have to see it, of course, but nothing is quite as it kind of. It's not easy, and I believe that particularly with this property, the only way to find out for certain where the water's getting in is to do some extensive opening up work. And my direction will be, at least at the beginning, that actually some work happens on the insides to open up the reveals and open up the window head to see if there's any obvious signs of where that water's coming from. Now, the question is that, we get into what do we do next, because we know that there's a poor detail at the top, there's a poor detail at that roof intersection. Should these be fixed as a matter of course? If we do that, then we're talking about quite substantial amounts of money to do that, because you can't take a bit of the external wall insulation off and then just refix it. It will be difficult, it will be expensive, and it will be very disruptive. So I'm going to do the first one of the polls, and we're going to look at a couple of case studies. So this property again is this wasn't done under a grant scheme. This was the insulation on this property was funded by the owner. And what's peculiar about this house is that even though it has external wall insulation, it has EWI. It's only got a couple of inches, so it's only got 50 mil of insulation on the wall. It's also a cavity constructed building, so it's got cavity walls. It's not solid wall in anywhere in any so I could see it's all cavity wall building. The main complaint that the client has is a little bit of dampness getting in around the windows at ground floor levels. You see the 3 paned windows on the right and left hand side. Both of them have some water in the reveals and across the window head. So that's kind of that. And so really, I kind of want you to look at that, and you are looking at that, and I'd like you to kind of have a think about what you think the major issues, if any, are on that property. Is it walker ingress? Is it cold bridging? Is it interstitial condensation or mold? Or is it something else? Now, this is all a bit fake because we did get the results from the poll the last time we did it, and the results were 70% thought there would be a water ingress problem, 20% said it would be cold bridging, 10% said there would be an interlayer quality and condensation issue, and nobody said something else. Well, I can tell you, my concerns are all of them equally, because the building doesn't have any provision for ventilation, again, as far as I can see. And there are a couple of fans in the back, but really it's very, very poorly ventilated. So that's that one. But the issue with the water at the windows was relatively simple. You can see the image at the top left-hand corner. That's taken off the ladders looking at the windowsill at first floor level. And the window sills have been formed in polystyrene or in an insulation material. And if you look really carefully, you can just about see the scrim as the scrim has been made up onto the existing UPVC windowsill. And then that gunk has been stuck on the outside. Well, naturally, it's contracted and expanded. It's heated up and cooled down, and a crack has appeared. So the water's hitting the windows, running straight down onto that sill and then down that crack. And what I believe is happening is running into the wall. And because it's a cavity wall, it's running down until it hits the window head, it hits the lintel, the cavity tray, whatever might be in there, and then it's running down the outsides. So that's the easy explanation for the water that we can see on the inside of the property. There isn't any mold, there isn't any condensation, but you've got 2 people living in that building. It's I think it's 5 bedrooms in total, or 4 bedrooms and an office. And it's a big old box, and they're just not creating enough moisture in there to cause a problem. We've also got to remember that we're looking at these in September after a very warm summer. So there was no evidence of any condensation, but I do have concerns about air quality. The other things, however, that we spotted, or that worse, I say the royal we, that I spotted as we were going around. This is the property with the working from the bottom left, with the issue of continuity with the fence post, but also at the bottom right hand corner of the screen, you can see where the meter, the gas meter, has been worked around. So that's another great big cold bridge and a great big cold spot in the insulation. The insulation stops short of the floor, and it's about ground level. But also the top right-hand image is the feature at the ridge. So the roof hasn't been extended. There's a cover strip on the insulation. But when we get right up to have a look at it, even though the cover strip detail is okay, the cap that goes over the top of the cover strip has been gummed together. It's been butt jointed, so there's no overlaps where it runs down. And then the insulation where the joints are is just shocking. So there's holes. So in the roof, with the wind in the right direction and a good degree of rain, which is not uncommon for that part of Wales, you will get water running into the top of that wall. Now, the photograph in the middle of the image is of the. I'm going to try and go back if I can. Go back a couple. Is that porch roof? So the lower right section of the porch roof. And there's a hole you can get your finger in it. It's where the lead has actually been pushed out of the way to try and get the insulation in. They've managed to create a feature that directs water in behind the insulation, but as yet it's not showing a problem internally. So the only element of the only one of these defects that we've spotted that's causing a problem is that detail on the windowsill at first floor level. Yet. Now I'm going to show you another photograph. You notice on the image, you can see in the background, there's a flat roofed section on the right. Inside there's a utility room and a boot room, quite a big space. But again, really nice and clean, no dampness, fitted wardrobes, fitted cupboards in there. But if you watch this video, it shows you what we can see if we look carefully from the outside.
Give some context. This is the front wall of parapet with the extension to the right hand side of the front, and the parapet not great condition is cracked. And that's done evidence that water is sitting in there. There will be a profile, but if you really do that flat parapet, it is a flat parapet, it will get behind the insulation.
Okay, so I hope you can see that, again, there is no complaint about dampness on the inside of the building, but to the even vaguely trained eye, we're starting to spot defects that we know must have some long-term implication. And to me, this throws up a number of really kind of difficult questions. So the instruction on that property was to go and investigate, would have been to investigate those two areas of dampness around the windows at ground floor level. Now, to do that, all you would say is that, yes, all right, you've got a defect with the windowsills upstairs, and actually what you need to do is remodel that, and your dampness down in the area below will go. But, you know, does the surveyor have a moisture specialist, a damp surveyor, or even a chartered surveyor, have an obligation to spot those other areas of potential water ingress? And if we do, what then do we have to say about how we remediate those? Do we recommend repairs? Or do we only deal with the bits that are causing a problem now? And if we do recommend repairs or remediation or improvements to the overall insulation project, then where do we stop, and how do we give assurances on that? Now, the one thing that with that particular property that really starts to worry me is that it's got cavity wall ties in it, and that front wall of that building will almost certainly, the masonry underneath, the external masonry leaf of brickwork will be wet. it will be wet, far wetter than the evidence that we can gather from the outside shows, and certainly it will not be indicative of what's happening with the internal leaf. What to me is showing is the cavity is still working really well, but the external leaf of that building will be soaking. Now, that means that the ties are constantly wet. That means that actually, are we getting a problem there? The other things that sort of spark into my mind are, what are the timbers like? Where are the timbers? Have we got joist ends bearing into those walls? Have we got lintels embedded? And how is that going to work in the long term? So, you know, we think about, you know, how do we recommend fixes? How do we recommend courses of action? You know, all of those things are kind of at the fore of my mind when I'm thinking about it, and I guess that they will be in every surveyor's mind. But I don't necessarily have all the answers. The other thing with that building is that do we have a responsibility to consider air quality? We can see because we've got eyes that building has very few outlets for air. There's no ventilation in the bathrooms. There's no trickle vents. There's no provision for maintaining good air quality. And again, is that something that we should be flagging up at the point of investigation? My belief is that argument has already happened, or that conversation has already happened, and I believe that we do have an obligation to pick up and consider and inform our clients where we see the potential for poor or ineffective ventilation leading to problems with air quality. And the other question that's kind of always kicking around in our minds is if we do repair this stuff and we do repair the water inside, can we guarantee it? Now, to me, I can't see how industry can guarantee or give long-term assurances based on stuff that we are kind of patching up, that was installed by somebody else whose quality control was probably dubious, looking at what we can see. So I'm going to show you another one. This property. This is the one that we looked at the beginning, the old lady living on her own. Have a look at this image. And again, we ran a poll on this. Same questions. Water ingress, talking about cold bridging, internal air quality, or something else. Well, we got a complete split on this. It was 30-30-10. I'm not sure what the other thing is, but trust me, there's enough on this property to make sure there probably is something else. So we can see that the window is cracked open. So that's the only ventilation, I think, in the house at the time of the inspection. But at least, you know, she's doing that. But let's look at some of the details on this. The lead work. It's currently got a fiberglass roof across the offshoot. The fiberglass roof is absolutely appalling, and the lead work, the lead flashing, is just diabolical. Now, to give you a clue, I thought that there's currently quite severe water ingress in this property. It's actually running in when it rains. It runs into the house, and I think we've got some. I might have some photographs next of how the lady has stuck bits of tin foil to the wall with gaffer tape to make sure it doesn't drip on her stuff, and that it's directed through some sort of Heath Robinson system of gullies and traps and bits of tin foil, so it runs into buckets on the floor when it rains hard. And she does that every night before she goes to bed. So there's water getting in. There's quite a considerable amount of water getting in. So is it down to the insulation? Well, I took a hose pipe on the roof and started working in sections to see where I could find some water ingress. I have to tell you that I started around the windows and around the features, trying to kind of do things in a small area, bit by bit, with the occupant stood in below the Velux window that you can see there, ready to tell me when she could see water. It took less than 20 seconds, I think, from the time that slightly longer than that, but very, very quickly from playing water onto the roof that it started dripping in and then running in quite large volumes. Now, the main issue here is the fact that actually the Velux window was retained, and they fit the fiberglass roof around the Velux window. But they also retained the lead work, the lead flashing when they did that. The whole thing is an absolute car crash with really, really bad detailing. There are, however, a number of incredibly bad pieces of detail with what's gone on at the back of the house. When you do put water onto the wall, it runs down that stop strip and then runs down the full length of that and then hits the peculiar little indented feature there where the rainwater pipe comes from above. It goes into not a hopper, but it runs into the gutter below, and then you've got that kick in the downpipe that allows water to run into that box. So there's tons of water that congregate and hit that area there, and the detailing is appalling. Though that is not the primary source of water ingress that we saw in the room below. We've also got a question about the roof feature. So the top right-hand photograph is of the roof. That's pretty ugly. Just the whole thing is a desperate mess. But how much of it is down to the insulation? Well, some of it, but an awful lot more of it is down to the roof, the gutters, not the roof, and the lead work and the Velux window. So now I'm not quite sure where to go with this particular job. Other than the fact that actually what really needs to happen is everything needs to come off and it needs to be done properly. So I know that this kind of has been a real romp through the subject. We've only got 45 minutes and some time for questions, so it's very, very difficult to kind of cover everything. The subject is going to be one that develops over the months and the years. And it's something that we're all going to have to think about. And we're all going to have to get a grip on as time goes on. We are very, very keen as an organization not to sound as though we're being down on retrofit. Retrofit is really important. It has to work, and it has to work well. Its reputation has to be enhanced, and we've all got to adopt it in order to save ourselves, or save the planet, and give something to our kids that's worth having. So we've got to make this work, and my real message is that let's fund it properly, let's do it properly, and let's do it with our eyes wide open, because we can make retrofit, whether it's internal, external, or cavity, work to our advantage. We just need to understand what we're doing and do it well. So we look forward to the Green Homes grant scheme delivering quality, we hope. And that some of the pitfalls from previous schemes will be avoided. So Andy, I think we do have a few questions. I can't remember what they were, so perhaps if you could pitch them, and I'll do my best to answer them. But thank you all.
No, we certainly do, and I think you were bang on just with that last point there. Just what you mentioned about we're not being down on people doing retrofit. We just really want it to be done right, effectively. So a few questions that we've got. We don't have lots, but I'm going to start off just with Keith Gilby. Keith actually has two questions, but I'll read out the first one. In practical terms, Steve, do you envisage every external wall installation being checked, signed off, guaranteed, and then confirmed fit for purpose without any cold bridge areas before a contractor is actually paid?
Right. So much of the work that we looked at there, apart from the big house, was funded under government schemes and RECO, and they would have been subject to PAS 2030 17 or potentially 2030 17 conditions, and there was a requirement there for quality and quality of installation, but there wasn't much by way of liability on design. And then the passing and signing off process was kind of not as good as it could be. So the incarnations of the PAS regulations or the PAS standards have led us to 2035. And 2035 does require that there's other independent professionals in that delivery process. So there's a retrofit designer, and there's a retrofit assessor, and there's the other. But these independent professionals are there to assure the design of the system will deliver on the intended energy savings, and then the assessors and the supervisors go in to make sure that the work is done to a high quality and that actually what has been specified has been executed, trying in a way that tries to avoid some of the pitfalls that we've seen here, and delivers a good long-term solution. Now, the other thing that all these jobs, if they're government funded, need to have is a 25-year warranty. Now, the PCA can't get 25-year warranties, but this is something that's etched into the rules of government with regards to the grants. And so they are supposed to get 25-year IBGs. So the answer there, Keith, is that in the past, not so much. In the future, yes, one hopes so. But the Green Homes Grant Scheme is being delivered under the terms of 2030, 17 and 19, not 35. And so the stuff that's about to happen, if we all get out of lockdown and we're allowed to do it, is all relating to 2030, 17, 19, and not the newest standards, because those retrofit assessors and coordinators just aren't there at the moment. They're not qualified, they're not available. So that level of diligence is not going to be there on this round of funding. But let's not kid ourselves. There's a lot of retrofit out there already. There's an awful lot of not great retrofit, whether it's external or whether it's cavity, that's out there already that we have to be aware of and consider the consequences of as we're looking at buildings that have been improved in those ways.
Okay, well, part two of Keith's question, and you're going to have to maybe glance into your crystal ball here, so it's a wee bit of a finger in the air. But Keith is asking, do you think or can you see happening in the future designers stroke installers offering any meaningful science-based heat loss saving guarantees?
No. Guarantees are a peculiar thing. You know, you can guarantee that you will save a proportion of heat, but if you're making claims that are aimed to be, you know, are we going to save exactly this much? That's not kind of how it works. And kind of that, to me, it's kind of dangerous to do so. Having said that, you know, you are supposed to. One is supposed to, if you're looking at a retrofit project, supposed to model it, so you know what the energy performance of the building is before, and then you compare that with the modeled outcomes of the property with, and so it gives you an indication of how well you've improved its thermal performance, and from that you can derive an estimated energy saving and therefore an economic or financial saving post and pre. So those sorts of things will come along, and there will be people making claims that you will save X amount of money if you adopt these things, and some of that will be accurate and some of that won't. But if you're looking at some things that says guarantees, so you'll be able to sue somebody if you don't save enough money, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. Okay, next question. Next question comes from a Steve Young. In terms of improving ventilation and helping improve air quality within a building, will powered ventilation systems be covered under the Greenhouse Grant, or is it just passive ventilation systems?
The Green Homes Grant Scheme does allow for ventilation improvements. And as far as we can see on the documents that have come through, then powered or mechanical ventilation is absolutely covered in that. It's not just passive systems. It's written in a peculiar way in the Bayes document, but as far as I can see, that mechanical systems are certainly admissible. The one thing that I would say is that despite quite a lot of effort on our part, those enabling works, so the damp control stuff, the structural repairs, and the ventilation improvements have all been acknowledged as being important parts of the delivery of a retrofit project under the Green Homes Grant Scheme. However, we don't have clear indications of how you're going to get paid. At the moment, it would appear that the only way that those enabling works are going to get done is if you are a subcontractor to the main insulation contractor. and you may well have to wait quite a considerable amount of time if you're going to do these works to get paid. So just be aware. But no, Steve, mechanical ventilation is admissible under the terms of the scheme. Okay.
Well, next question comes from Jennifer Cole. Now, again, I think this is a little bit of a finger in the air, Steve, because you can't see the property. But she's asking, what advice can you give someone that unfortunately has now had problems with what you're calling shallow refit? Are there organisations people can turn to?
The fact is that if you are having problems with a property that's been retrofitted, then you have recourse to the contractor that did the work. The problem is that because of the way the funding models have worked, there's been an awful lot of liquidations in the insulation industry. Because the problem is that there's grants, but there's not continuity between the grants. So it all seemed a bit wild westy at the moment, or in the past, and perhaps even looking forward, we want to get rid of that boom and bust in contracting. But the fact is that if the contractor is not there anymore, then all these jobs should have been covered by warranties. And the all 4 buildings that I looked at and that feature in this presentation are all being serviced by the warranty provider. So if that warranty hadn't have been available, those owners would not have had any recourse to anybody whatsoever. So yeah, there should be a warranty in place if they're government funded. If they're not government funded, all bets are off. But yeah, always go back to the contractor if the contract is in existence.
Just out of interest, any associations that you might suggest first foot forward if having difficulty with contractors?
Oh, well, it depends on whether they're a member of. But for external wall insulation, it's Swiga. There's Seeger and Swiga. Seeger are the cavity lot. Swiga are the people that are focused particularly on solid wall insulation. But the fact is that the contractors, if they they have to be members of these organisations for them to give you a hand out, to give you a hand. And if you're going to a trade association, it's the same as if you come to PCA for help. We're happy to help, but we do need some information, and we're particularly focused on helping members of the public that are working with members of the association. So yeah, there are organisations, but they're organisations that operate like trade bodies rather than any government enabled regulators.
Yeah, and I think, Jennifer, just to add to that as well, I think if it maybe highlights the importance of doing your due diligence and checking to make sure that a contractor has actually qualified correctly and is part of representative associations within the industry as well. At least you have some sort of fallback position.
Well, the Green Homes Grant Scheme requires all the contractors that are working in that to be registered with Trustmark as well. Trustmark for the insulation then register each job on their database, and PCA are a Trustmark scheme operator for the preservation and the damp side of things, the ventilation and the wall tie side of things. But we would also suggest that if people are having issues with Green Homes Grant stuff, but this is the most recent round of funding, that Trustmark is also another point of contact.
Okay. Next question, Simon Ward. It's kind of flipping it onto kind of values, but he's suggesting as great as insulation can be, and is there actually any evidence out there that actually suggests the capital value benefit to a property for adding this in? Now, again, I mean, I know this is a crystal ball thing, Steve, but are you aware of any evidence?
Not really at the moment, howeve. We all have to have an energy performance certificate when we buy and sell houses. And if you've perhaps got a really bad EPC, then the fact of the matter is that you may well have some resistance from a purchaser, or reluctance from a landlord, from a purchaser. And in some regards, if you're a landlord, then your EPC has to be at a certain value before you can legally rent it. And those requirements are going to get tighter, not laxer with time. So there are certainly potentially financial penalties if you have a particularly poorly thermally performing property. I'm not sure yet whether there's any real financial, if you like, commercial benefits in regards to property values if you've got a building that works particularly well. Having said that, this is probably the way the world will go. And I totally support that. Surely it makes sense that if somebody has invested in the energy performance of a building and it's warmer and more comfortable and it's well done, that should be worth more than a house that leaks like a sieve, costs a lot to heat, and is bad for the planet.
Okay. Well, the last question comes from a Tony Fields, came in via email just actually after the webinar. Now, he did ask me to stipulate that he appreciates you're not an insulation specialist here, and he appreciates that one fit doesn't fit all. But he's asking, in your opinion, and if given the choice, what form of wall insulation would you go for and recommend if given the choice between external, cavity, or internal?
I would personally, I think that's relatively easy. Personally, I would go for external wall insulation, but I would go for external wall insulation knowing precisely what I was doing and making sure there was sufficient funds and sufficient money to do all the enabling works to ensure that could be done properly. I wouldn't have EWI if it was worked around roof lines or gutters or anything else. I like the whole idea of that you keep the whole fabric warm and dry and you don't leave anything that's sort of sacrificial. Internal wall insulation scares me. You know, to me, if you're going to put insulation in the inside of the property, then you need trying to get continuity is incredibly difficult. And cavity wall insulation equally, I have not issue with, because if it's done, it can be done really, really well, and it can give extremely good returns. But again, it's not being able to see it, service or maintain it that causes me to scratch my head. And I have to say, the house that I'm sat in now, delivering this project proposal from, or this presentation from, the original part of the house has cavity wall insulation. We have extended it and changed it around, and every time we open up a wall, we find another area of missing insulation or something that's slumped or whatever. So, you know, all these forms of insulation are good if they are done well. But if you're asking me what I would do, it would definitely be EWI all day long.
Well, there you go, folks. Well, guys, just to kind of finish off this kind of webinar, this re-recording of the webinar, for those that are looking for just any kind of extra guidance and training information, first place I just want to point you off to is to visit our technical documents library. Lots of information, help and advice in there. But for anyone that's looking for any kind of knowledge top-ups, there is a variety of training courses that you can speak to our training team on, most notably the ones which are on the screen there: Defects in Cavity Construction, Retrofit Insulation Masterclass, and Residential Ventilation Masterclass. Of course, you can also watch this webinar again to your heart's content. What's going to be our next webinar? Next webinar is going to be on the 26th of November. Now, at the time of when we actually did the real webinar on the Thursday, we hadn't actually decided what we were going to do. And that was mainly because it was going to be the last one for 2020, and we're having a wee think about it. I will say we have made a decision now. We will be communicating that out very shortly. All you need to do, though, if you fancy sign up for the next webinar link is there. It's just property-care.org/webinars. Last but not least, I just want to say a big thank you to all for listening to this re-recording. We do apologise to everyone that came on for the live recording that unfortunately had technical difficulties right at the end. Big thank you for coming back on if you are one of those attendees and you've now listened to the re-recording. And hopefully we see you at the next webinar on the 26th of November. So I suppose it's a goodbye from myself, a goodbye from Steve, and we hope you have a lovely rest of the day.